I remember the first time I rode Skyrush. It was in the month of September back in 2014. I casually walked into the line, slightly nervous, but that's because it's been a few months since my last coaster ride. I had no idea what I was about to experience. I kept a very low, under-the-radar approach when it came to reviews and opinions of this interesting hypercoaster. Just watching it from the ground, I wasn't expecting much. I thought those smaller airtime hills would produce some floater airtime, but little did I know how intense this roller coaster would turn out to be. Presentation. Hersheypark doesn't like to waste a single section of their property, so with no surprise, Skyrush has been strategically placed into a small piece of land that wraps around Comet, their original wooden coaster. The station is placed right next to the lift hill of Comet, without any wiggle room to work with. It's rare when a roller coaster has to have the entrance and exit ramp on the same side of the station, but because of the small space that they are working with, this was a solution that Intamin came up for Skyrush. It can be a little chaotic in the station as oncoming riders are working their way into the train while a couple stragglers exiting the train are fighting their way through the crowd. Skyrush has no theming, well, sorta. The name Skyrush doesn't seem to imply that much until you watch how fast the cable lift pulls this train to the top of the hill. I think from the moment you leave the station until you are diving down the hill, it's about 15 seconds. The other aspect of the name Skyrush implies is that the insane ejector airtime this coaster produces, but we'll talk more about that in a bit. The bright yellow track with light blue supports really pop. Personally, I think it's a fun color scheme, different from your typical red track that you seem to find on most Intamin coasters. Skyrush earns an 8 rating score for presentation, and that's mostly because of how well this coaster interacts with Comet and other attractions in close proximity. Ride intensity. Honestly, it doesn't get more intense than Skyrush. This is up there as one of the most intense roller coasters that I've ever experienced. Intamin pulled no punches when designing Skyrush. The ride starts off with a startling fast lift pulling you to the top of its 200-foot drop. The first drop delivers an insane amount of airtime in the back row. In fact, during one of my recent rides, I actually thought the coaster was going to eject me from the ride. Obviously, that's not the case, but that's how it made me feel. At the bottom of the drop, the coaster flies into a sharp bend to the right, launching into the first ejector airtime hill. Skyrush is the king of ejector airtime. Not only do these airtime hills produce strong airtime, it's also sustained for a couple of seconds. The coaster then slams into a sharp left-hand turn. This is where you'll experience the strongest positive G's. I've been known to gray out during this turn. Well, after completing this turn, the coaster is now set up to enter yet another ejector hill that makes you feel like you're going to be ejected into the track right above you. Skyrush now enters a sharp turn to the right, which leads you into an exciting overbanked turn. This element is a nice change of pace from the first two airtime hills. If you are seated on the left side of the train, the coaster will feel like it's trying to toss you out of the side of the train, in case you haven't picked up on the theme yet, which is ejector airtime. The ride then enters another turn to the right, this time leading into an airtime hill S-turn. This moment provides some more ejector airtime and laterals. The coaster closes out with a small bunny hill, bank turn to the left, and a small hop up into the first brake run. Because the ride is built over top of Comet, the brake run has to be split up. The coaster then takes a small dive to the right into the final brake run. Once you come to a complete stop, the restraints on Skyrush will let up just a bit to alleviate any pain from your thighs being crushed by the awkward lap bar. I think it goes without saying, but Skyrush gets a perfect 10 rating for ride intensity. Fun factor. I know I'm going to get some flack here, but Skyrush isn't going to earn a perfect 10 rating in the fun factor. Beyond the thigh crushing from the restraints that would hold this coaster back, Skyrush isn't a consistent attraction. The ride runs sluggish in the morning, which isn't that uncommon with other coasters, but depending on which row and seat you are in, your experience will range very widely. I found out that the front rows in a middle seat can be less intense, but you'll experience some roughness that you don't get while seated in a wing seat. Now, this might be a good time to mention, but Skyrush has a very weird train. Each row has 2 wing seats, they sit slightly lower than the middle seats, and have no floor underneath them. These wing seats are the most intense and will produce the strongest airtime and thigh-crushing experiences. The airtime on Skyrush is amongst the strongest I have ever experienced on any coaster. Depending on how you look at things, this could be a great thing or possibly a negative. If your restraints are tightly clamped down, the airtime can get pretty painful. If by some miracle your restraints aren't crushing you, then you're in for a real treat. Overall, Skyrush is still an enjoyable attraction. For the most part, I can look past the thigh-crushing action, but sometimes it can be a bit much, even for me. In the end, I think Skyrush earns a 9 score for the fun factor. Originality. The layout looks very simple on paper. A basic figure 8 pattern makes up the majority of the ride. With that said, Skyrush takes the layout and cranks up the intensity. The ride stays low to the ground. Even the airtime hills are rather small when compared to a normal hypercoaster. The coaster manages to keep its breakneck speed up until the final pass back to the brake run. I was slightly surprised that the coaster doesn't fly into the brakes as it would on previous Intamin creations. Here are a few examples: Superman the Ride, Millennium Force, Superman Ride of Steel, Maverick, Top Thrill Dragster, and King of Ka, of course, Stormrunner and Fahrenheit, which both operate at Hersheypark, and with some gas still left in the tank. Skyrush feels like it makes its final approach only operating on fumes. I may sound like I'm complaining about this aspect, but honestly it doesn't bother me, just found it curious. The same can also be said about Intimidator 305, but that's because the ride is trimmed to death during the final airtime hills. Not only is the layout something unique, but the trains are very unusual. I feel like Intamin was near completion in designing this coaster when they noticed B&M building a wing coaster, so they were like, yeah, we can work that in, and came up with this hybrid train featuring floorless wing seats and more traditional seats in the middle. It may look weird, but it's actually a genius idea. These trains allow for a good dose of variety, giving you an excuse to walk back in line. All in all, Skyrush takes the coaster intensity to a level that most coasters wouldn't dare to try, which is why Skyrush earns a 10 rating for originality. Ride smoothness. My first ride back in 2014, I thought this coaster was butter smooth. Now that I've got to re-ride Skyrush 6 years later, I'm starting to notice some of its flaws. The second biggest ding against Skyrush is the roughness. Depending on where you are seated, be prepared for a few nasty bumps along the way. The worst is noticed when you're riding in any row in the middle seat during the 180-degree turn after the first airtime hill. If you sit in a wing seat, I realize that the roughness doesn't become much of an issue. Sure, there is some rattling going on, but nothing painful. It's kind of ironic. Sit in a wing seat to avoid the roughness, but instead you'll be simply trading it out for more thigh-crushing by your restraint. I believe the reason it's worse in a wing seat is because you can't use your feet to push your legs up against a restraint. I tried it out and realized if you sit in a non-wing seat, the restraints are more tolerable, but the intensity and airtime will be muted. Skyrush gets a score of 8 for ride smoothness. Okay, the final score comes to 9, which is a fantastic rating. It's not the 10 score I remember it being a few years ago, but it's still a powerhouse to be reckoned with. I can understand why some consider this to be their favorite roller coasters, and others dislike it. Similar to I-305, I believe the GP don't fawn over this attraction like most coaster enthusiasts would. The intensity will deter some average-going riders, while us coaster nerds are drawn to it like a bug heading toward a strong light. My personal score is going to be a 9.5. I was expecting to fall in love with Skyrush all over again, but instead realized that I had my expectations set to unrealistic levels. I'm still a fan of Skyrush, don't get me wrong, it's still a great coaster, but realize that it has some flaws that I just can't gloss over as I would in the past. The restraints are awful, there's no denying that fact, and the coaster's inconsistent rides makes this a tough beast to tackle. I feel like, sure, you can minimize the restraint tightness, but at the cost of better airtime and smooth ride experience. Or, sitting up front will be smoother and less intense on the thighs, regardless of which seat, but again at the cost of great airtime. The very back row never seems to disappoint when it comes to airtime, but be prepared for Skyrush's alter ego, Thigh Crush. Well, thank you for watching today's review. What do you think of Skyrush? I want to hear all about it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button. As always, don't forget to subscribe, that way you won't miss out on more great content coming your way by XscreamThrills.